issues and candidates. Today we are dealing with issues, and we have the honor of welcoming Bill Duncan with us in the studio. Bill, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Bill, for a bit of history, you're a you're a New England native. Pardon me for just swear words there. After graduating from Boston Latin, you attended the Naval Academy in Annapolis.
That's right.
You included in your tour of duty was Vietnam as a political warfare advisor. On leaving the military, you spent many years in business, eventually creating Daylight Software, which you sold in 2005, software program.
Yeah.
But you also understood that as a citizen, giving back to the society was essential. To that end, you have the distinction of building the leading economic development organization in Central Appalachia, providing jobs and credit for low-income families, clearly just making money without consideration for those less fortunate. And for the society as a whole, just isn't in your genes. So for that, you deserve our heartfelt thanks. So thank you very much. Now, you and your wife, who is the founding director of the Carsey Institute at UNH, currently live in Newcastle. Did I get that all right?
Exactly right.
Hey, lucky day for me, you know. Bill, many of the people with your success would have just sat back and enjoyed retirement. However, you've taken a substantially different tack, I should say. You've stepped forward to promote education as critical to the success of our communities, our state, our nation. Could you please tell us a bit why you see education as such a critical path to our success?
Well, as a business person, it was always clear how important an educated workforce was to my business and all the others around me. And when I saw what the legislature was doing to education in this last session, there was really no choice but to try to address it. House members had introduced over 40 terrible bills, everything from disbanding the Department of Education to making school attendance voluntary. And it just seemed like too big a hit to New Hampshire public education to let it go unremarked upon. So I started, just for friends initially, letting people know what it was I saw happening in the legislature. Send a little email now and then, put things on a website so that they could easily be referred to. And it grew. I called it Defending New Hampshire Public Education. Very cumbersome but straightforward way to describe what I was about. And I started talking with legislators about their priorities for New Hampshire education. And I found that the House Education Committee, if I could characterize the majority, at least, on that committee, I would say that dismantling public education was in their sights. And I thought it was very important to oppose that in every way that we could.
Now, you talked about what you were dealing with in that sense, but could you elaborate perhaps just a little bit on education as such a critical path, to our success as a state, as towns, communities, and as a state?
We spend $3 billion a year in New Hampshire on our public education systems, the vast bulk of which comes from our property tax. And maybe 7 or 8% from the federal, and about 20% comes from state aid to education in the communities that need it. And for that, what we get is one of the best public education systems in the country. Testing in the 3rd and the 8th and the 11th grades, we consistently stand in the top 1 or 2 in science and math and other subjects that we test in. So New Hampshire has a public education system of which it can be proud. But I saw that system denigrated repeatedly in our legislature, and the keystone piece of legislation aimed at dismantling this valuable system we've built over generations was the voucher bill that went by various names in the last legislature. But basically, what it does is gives businesses tax credits in return for the business contribution to scholarships for our children, to induce them to leave public schools and go to private schools. They turn out mainly to be Christian religious schools, but that fundamentally is aimed at beginning the process of disinvesting in our public school system. In some big cities around the country, this kind of voucher system is put into use to help kids who are in certifiably terrible situations in big city, inner city public schools. But in a state where we can be proud of our school system, this voucher system offers us nothing, but costs us millions in the first year and growing automatically year by year to the extent that it gets used. It grows further and further indefinitely into the future, so that it could be dealing with tens of thousands of our children, pulling them out of our public schools and putting them into ever-growing private, religious, and home schools. We're one of the few states that have included homeschooling in their voucher program. So a student can get a voucher that needs to average about $2,500 per year per student. Some can be larger and smaller, to go to private school. They can get almost $700 a year to do what many were doing already in homeschool, to be homeschooled at home, to pay expenses for additional courses or course materials. So the program is aimed at subtly inducing as many children as possible to leave our public schools. The result would be less and less investment in our schools, because what happens is the state provides a tax credit to a business for making this contribution, but then takes money back from the local school budget. The state aid that had gone for that child now comes back to the state, so it comes directly out of the local school budget. And in fact, it's even worse than that, because what actually happens is that in Manchester, the voucher might cost $2,500, but the state will take back, say, $4,000, $4,500 for each child who leaves. But in Newcastle, where I live, we don't get any state aid. In Portsmouth and Rye, about 30 communities in New Hampshire don't get state aid. So when a child leaves with a voucher, there's no money for the state to take back. So it's the Manchester money that pays, and Londonderry, of course, money that pays for Newcastle, Rye, Portsmouth, other children to go to these private schools. So it's a perverse circular funding mechanism, all aimed at disinvesting in New Hampshire's public schools.
Well, that's generally a frightening consideration.
Yes, it's the real deal. It's like an IED, an explosive device planted in our school system that goes off slowly over a period of years and grows. If it takes root, it'll just continue to grow. And as the damage grows, there could be lack of political will to stop it as it keeps on going. That's the way it's happened in other states in some cases.
And that's the overriding fear that we have to deal with here.
Yes, exactly right.
Now, let's step away a bit from the voucher system. We'll come back to it a little bit further on, but maybe on a broader topic, we can talk about what you see as the role of our towns and our state and our nation providing education to our children.
We have 50 million children in public school in the United States, and we have 200,000 or so, a decreasing number each year, in New Hampshire. And there will be no real replacement for the generations-long commitment to public schools with our elected school boards that we have in place in the country right now. However, the voucher systems and what's called school choice, to some extent charter schools are a part of this movement, but the voucher programs are the most serious threat to traditional public schools. These voucher systems will grow over the years if they're allowed to, and they'll eat away at the student body in our central traditional public schools and reduce the budgets, reduce the number of children available to be taught, and as a result reduce the instructional quality of our public schools in favor of a private school alternative that, in New Hampshire's case, has no accountability. These are schools that, some of which may be good, some not so good, but it was very important to the sponsors of this bill not to include any form of accountability. Whenever I lobbied for more, and others, for more accountability, the sponsors would say the parents have the ultimate accountability. They can take their children out of the schools. That's the built-in accountability.
So you're saying that if Harry and Mabel decide that they don't want to have their children in school because they think education is a waste, that they can pull them out, and the child can effectively go on and not gain an education effectively, a formal education most assuredly, and then if his or her performance is not so good because he or she doesn't have the tools to be successful, it really falls then on the state and on all of us to carry the burden.
Absolutely. And beyond that, many of these schools, in New Hampshire, there are 43 little Christian schools, most of them very small, private schools, who will take probably 90% of the voucher children who are drawn out of our public schools. And the curriculum there, I'm sure some of them are rigorous, there's no question, but the dominant curriculum is a creationist foundation for teaching, creationist math, creationist history, evolution as a theory that has been disproven. These are things for which our state dollars will be paying. So we'll pay twice. We'll be diseducating our children in these kinds of schools, and we'll pay, as you describe, when they join society in a way and are not able to be productive in our workforce. Absolutely.
That's a frightening thought. I'm going to shift away just a little bit from that and talk about our legislature. You referenced it a bit earlier, but over the past 20 months, our legislature has taken a number of actions on education. Could you please give us your insight into those actions and the impact that you believe it will have on our towns? And I'm going to exclude the voucher system. We talked a little bit about it before, and we're going to talk a little bit more as we go on. But how does this impact, and is there, are we seeing what's called downshifting? Are we seeing that as a practice to drive this system into our communities? Or defund our communities?
Yes. One of the centerpieces of this year was the reduction of state aid to communities. So while the system is complex, the single bouncing ball to watch is the amount of general fund money, or sometimes called education trust fund money, that comes from the business profits tax and a certain amount from other taxes, and goes to our public schools from the state. And in recent years has been about $600 million a year. And that's what comprises the 20% of the total school budget of $3 billion that the state provides to communities in need. This last legislature reduced that by $140 million and then protected our communities from the immediate impact with certain details that we won't get into here, but it held communities harmless. If you deserved a lot more, you wouldn't get it, and if you deserved a lot less, you wouldn't get less. Mm-hmm. You would get what you got in 2011. But that is over unless the next legislature takes an active decision to continue it. So if left to its own devices, our communities would start to see a reduction in school aid starting next year. And then they have a choice. They either reduce the instructional program or they increase local property taxes. So you could say that that was $140 million downshifted then and there in a way that wasn't visible, that hasn't made big news right then. The legislature, as you may know, attempted to pass out a constitutional amendment that would have virtually eliminated the responsibility for the legislature to fund education from the state level at all. This came this close to passage, but as a result of hard work on a broad variety of fronts by a large number of people, it was defeated in the House, and it will not be on the ballot. There are a couple of bad amendments that will be on the ballot, but not this particular education funding amendment. So we came this close to eliminating the requirement, basically, that the legislature fund education at all in New Hampshire.
So now the groups that fought so hard to prevent that from being forwarded or brought forward now, that wasn't as much a Democrat-Republican thing. As I understand it, this was kind of a bipartisan group that was saying, hey, we can't have this. This would be deadly to our structure long term.
Absolutely. Actually, in the legislature, there were three groups of legislators who combined to defeat this amendment. Certainly, 100% of the Democrats voted against the amendment. A small number, about 100 legislators. Another, call it 40, moderate Republicans who perhaps are plenty conservative, but have been in the legislature for a while. They're not Tea Partiers, they're old-line Republicans. And they value education in the state in the way that you would anticipate your friend, the Main Street Republican, to do. And the third group was the hardcore libertarians who disagreed with the strategy for making these changes to education funding. They felt that it took too much power away from the communities and gave it to the legislature, where the Democrats felt there was too much power taken from the courts and put into the legislature. So the three groups together combined to defeat this education funding amendment.
Okay, so one of the things that I understood, and I'll just briefly hit on it, and then we can move to public versus private education, which you touched on a bit, but I'll go and try to get into a little more detail in the last 10 minutes that we have here. I think it's important if we can define in the kind of the world of our educational cost. Education is a system like any business is a system, and there are base costs, shall we say, that they're basically standard whether you're talking about one student
Exactly.
or 100 students. It doesn't make any difference. You need a minimal number to make this work. And from that point on, you can incrementalize your cost based on the number of students that you're dealing with. But what I'm hearing from you, and please correct me if I misunderstand this, what I'm hearing from you is that the numbers that they're talking about taking away from us, the dollars that they're talking about taking out of the system, basically would, over time, fundamentally diminish the quality of education, because we would be into not the incremental cost, but the base cost of education.
Well, we're into the base costs right from the beginning. This was one of the central debates during the legislature. Good, earnest people who were considering whether or not to support the voucher bill needed to be satisfied that they would not be hurting their local school districts. And many studies have been done. The ones that are most rigorous suggest that a school might save as much as $500 in a year where a child leaves. So the child might get a $2,500 voucher, cost the school system $4,000 or $4,200 by leaving, and save the school system $500. So it's coming right out of their hide, right from the beginning.
Wow.
And the only choice at that point is the budget is smaller. You find out in September that 10 children won't be coming that you thought were coming. Mm-hmm. That's $40,000 less that you will have. That's even in a school system the size of Londonderry, with I think 5,000 children.
Plus, yeah.
So the numbers would be larger in Londonderry, but somebody has a $40,000 shortfall right off the bat, and there's no opportunity to take it out of increased property taxes at that point. There's not even any debate about it. It has to come out of instruction right then and there.
Ouch.
And then the next year, it'll be on the warrant, right? There'll be a question as to whether we're going to increase property taxes in order to cover this voucher deficit that we've incurred in Londonderry or not. And so there'll be this debate over, people will say, can we afford it? Others will say, can we afford to give our kids less education? There'll be that debate, and it will grow over time as more and more children leave. So there's really no alternative to, over time, making that trade-off between will we increase our property taxes indefinitely or reduce our educational quality.
Bill, thank you very much for that. That's not a very heartening set of comments here, but I'm going to go for just a couple more questions because we have about 6.5 minutes left here. I wanted your sense of public versus private education in terms of homeschooling, religious schools, charter schools. Is one better or worse? Do the records describe anything in this regard? What are your thoughts on this issue? And I'm going to kind of limit it to about 3 minutes here.
There have been many, many studies comparing the impact of voucher programs on public schools. And while advocates on each side, frankly, will cite their favorite studies that make their points, my own survey of it says there is no case to be made that a voucher program creates improvements either in the student outcomes, those of the students who take the vouchers and go to private schools, or as a result of competition with the public schools. Those are the two cases that advocates make. There is no data to support that. On the other hand, charter schools, in my reviews of the matter, divide between what you could call high-performing charter schools and I don't want to patronize anybody, but mom and pop charter schools. The high-performing charter schools are high-performing.
Right.
But the day-to-day charter schools tend to have similar results, and overall charter schools in the United States have results similar to our public schools. So private schools, charter schools, and public schools, statistically across the United States, have similar educational results for their children. Advocates can confuse you as you discuss it, but if you stand back and look, that's what happens. In homeschools, it's a whole different matter. We're all aware of superstars graduating from their
Sure.
families' homeschools, and those definitely exist, and they are inspiring. And so, and I've met many families in that category. But there's a whole range, as you would imagine, and so there's an increasing infrastructure of online learning support for these folks. And we have in New Hampshire some really strong examples of that. And so where some combination of parental framework, commitment on the part of the kids, and some instructional resources that fit together, then you can have great results from homeschools. I've never seen any statistical analysis that is really useful across a
Sure.
range because they vary so much.
Gotcha. Thank you very, very much for that. Now, we talked already a great deal about the voucher system. Obviously, you'd addressed it before. Do you have any other comments that you would like to make on that? And there is one thing that I would want to bring up. How do our town legislators, how have they addressed this issue?
They all, virtually all, voted in support of the voucher system, including overriding the governor's veto of the voucher system. So you have pretty strong support here in Londonderry for the voucher system. However,
From our legislators.
From your legislators, absolutely. However, I would say that virtually no legislator understood this very complex bill, except for the prime sponsor, Senator Forsyth. So the others did their earnest best, but it's a very complex bill. So I would imagine that your legislators do not know that Londonderry is paying for Newcastle and Rye and Portsmouth children to go to private schools.
That's another unfortunate consideration. Bill, we're really running down to the end here. If anybody wants to know more about this, how could they find out?
Well, there'll be a couple of important things happening. First, certainly go to my website,
Which is?
Defending New Hampshire Public Education. If you put that in a search, you'll
Okay.
find your way right to it.
Okay.
And keep an eye out on the Department of Revenue. This week, they will issue regulations, if not this week, next week, on this voucher system. Get involved, look at the regulations, see if it's transparent. My hope is that we will be able to monitor the voucher program in a constructive way, and these regulations will be transparent. If they don't look transparent to you, get involved. Give the department feedback. And in the upcoming legislature, I think this question of the towns receiving aid, subsidizing those towns that do not receive aid,
Are going to be an issue.
should be an issue front and center.
Great. Well, Bill, we're running out of time. It seems like it's gone in about a heartbeat here. But Bill Duncan, we appreciate your time, your insight into this extremely important issue. Thank you very much for coming. And for all of you listening today, thanks for listening to us, and good night.